The winter of 1915 marked the second year of World War I. Invading German troops had turned large parts of France into a battleground. But so far, they'd ignored the ancient French city of Verdun, where a conscientious colonel, Émile Driant, was posted. Worried about a German attack, Driant begged for more equipment, supplies, and men, but received only a reprimand. The French High Command should have listened. On February 21st, 1916, 1 million German troops attacked 200,000 Frenchmen guarding Verdun. The next day, Driant died defending his position, one of the first of hundreds of thousands killed in the course of what became the longest battle of the First World War.
This is a very concentrated battlefield with an awful lot of heavy artillery. It was a very nasty, difficult place to fight. No room for maneuver, very difficult, very dangerous terrain to fight over.
It's the first time in the modern era that we've seen a pure attrition strategy, that we've seen a battle fought for no purpose other than to inflict casualties on an enemy army.
They called Verdun the meat grinder, the furnace, hell. When the fighting died down, almost a year after it began, French and German armies were back where they started, minus close to 1 million men. The Battle of Verdun came to symbolize the senseless slaughter of the First World War. But for the French, who won the war at enormous cost, it left a deeper and more personal mark. The soul of France was ripped out in the muddy trenches of Verdun. To all appearances, pre-war France was sitting pretty.
Paris was the capital, as they used to say, of the 19th century. It was the heartland of the arts, of the avant-garde, of architecture, of design, of clothing. People lived better in France than most other European countries in terms of health or life expectation and so on. So the French had very good reason to feel that somehow they were at the center of the universe.
As Europe plunged toward war, each country prepared in its own way. The French military, like others, built up troops and weapons, but emphasized style over substance with its belief in élan, or spirit.
Regardless of the numbers, regardless of the overall strategic situation, always attack. And they took this and transformed it into a doctrine called l'offensive à outrance, or essentially the attack without limits. That if troops have superior morale and élan that surpassed their enemies, they would win, regardless of odds, regardless of situations.
And there was even a line of thought which argued that accepting casualties was a good thing, because the more men who died in a particular attack, the greater the moral force of the attack and the more significant the victory.
The Germans took a more practical approach. They developed fearsome new weapons, from enormous artillery guns to flamethrowers to poison gas. All of these would be used at Verdun. By August 1914, huge armies were on the march, and the Great War began. Germany and its ally Austria-Hungary attacked France and its allies Russia and Britain. Each side expected a quick victory, but found itself stuck in a deadly stalemate. By 1915, military leaders began to look for new strategies to win. First to act would be Germany's commander-in-chief, General Erich von Falkenhayn.
Falkenhayn had concluded that breaking through the enemy's front wasn't possible anymore. So what he was trying to do was effectively to use the stalemate to grind down the French army, and that's something that no commander had tried to do before. His purpose was to kill people.
The word for Falkenhayn's plan was attrition. A cold, secretive man, he told only Germany's emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm, his true goal. the Kaiser's son, Crown Prince Frederick Wilhelm, would have the honor of leading the battle that Falkenhayn promised would bleed France white. But he needed the right location.
Falkenhayn asked himself, where could I attack the French army, seize some terrain, and make them come back at me and take it back?
Falkenhayn chose the ancient fortified city of Verdun, dating back to Roman times. He knew it was a place the French would fight and die for.
There were two reasons for Verdun. First was the supply system. The French could only resupply it by one road that came from the southwest, from the town of Bar-le-Duc. The other reason was the importance that Verdun held to France. It had been a fortress that had not surrendered in previous wars. It was an important national symbol to the French.
Verdun's terrain and climate were perfect for Falkenhayn. Its cold winter fog could cloak the arriving German battalions. Its huge underground forts on the hilltops ringing Verdun would, if captured, force the French to counterattack uphill. And the surrounding countryside was full of heavily forested hills and valleys, which could hide the artillery Germany was shipping in on the 3 railroad lines it controlled, stretching from Verdun back to the fatherland.
The Germans had about 1,400 artillery pieces, ranging in size from 77 millimeters, which was their standard field piece, all the way up to 420 millimeters. And a 420 millimeter gun is so big that it had to be disassembled into 12 parts, and it took 12 wagons to move it. The shell was about a ton in weight, and they were enormously destructive.
The battle began on February 21st, 1916. German artillery bombarded French positions. They fired 2 million shells in 8 hours.
The Germans struck behind the firepower of the largest artillery barrage in human history. German guns delivered just an absolute horrific bombardment that went on for nearly an entire day before German stormtroop parties began to move forward. French defenses collapsed rapidly, and within the first couple of days, it looked like a complete disaster was to unfold.
By the 3rd day, the Germans had reached the largest of Verdun's forts, Douaumont, believed to be the strongest fort in Europe.
Fort Douaumont was a masterpiece of 19th century military engineering. It was situated on a 1,200-meter hill. It had massive stone walls. Much of the fort was underground, which kept the garrison of the fort safe from enemy artillery. By the 20th century, the French army no longer believed in fortifications. And so in 1914 and 1915, Fort Douaumont was seen as a dinosaur.
Thanks to France's top general, Joseph Joffre, Fort Douaumont was a toothless dinosaur. Like Falkenhayn, Joffre wanted to start a battle of attrition, but further north, along the Somme River.
The French High Command, General Joffre, he was plotting his own attack along the Somme for later that year of 1916. And so focused was he on the offensive himself, he could not really fathom that the Germans might beat him to the punch. He sent out a call which essentially cannibalized the entire fortress system of France, including the forts of Verdun, leaving them empty concrete shells devoid of most of their heavy armament.
Not only were Fort Douaumont's cannons gone, but its defenders were a small group of middle-aged French reservists. 4 days after the battle began, 3 German soldiers stumbled into a side entrance and captured the fort without firing a shot.
And Fort Douaumont was the single largest, single most powerful fort in the whole Verdun chain. So its loss, without even a fight being put up in its defense, was a tremendous shock. German schools let out for the day. German churches rang church bells to celebrate the accomplishment. It was celebrated all across Germany.
Only 150 miles from Paris, Verdun's loss could fatally damage French morale and bring down the government. For military and political reasons, Joffre did exactly what Falkenhayn expected. He poured in more troops and vowed to defend Verdun. And he sent in a new general, Henri-Philippe Pétain. Aloof and arrogant, Pétain was also a vocal critic of France's cult of the offensive and the toll it took on the troops. He understood better than most how murderous German artillery guns were and insisted on setting up a strong defense before beginning serious counterattacks.
The most important thing I think that Pétain did is he came in and stopped the pointless little counteroffensives that had been occurring all along the Verdun line. He ordered that no more attacks take place until they had been carefully thought out and carefully planned, and that meant an awful lot to French soldiers who had to do this fighting.
Pétain showed much more concern for the troops. He took much greater care to make sure that men had basic equipment, that they were recycled out of the trenches regularly enough so that they got leave and they didn't stay for days or even weeks at a time in the front lines.
Pétain's reorganization of the French artillery in the Verdun sector was arguably the most significant innovation of the entire battle. The French artillery doctrine involved sporadic fire, but there was no central direction of that. And what he did was he took these guns and gave them specific orders as to where to fire, and he wielded those guns like a sledgehammer.
Pétain did more. The French army's only supply line to Verdun was a road from the railroad town of Bar-le-Duc, 50 miles away. Pétain commandeered civilian trucks to keep supplies moving. All day and into the night, trucks passed each other every 14 seconds. And when winter turned into spring and the frozen road began to thaw, Pétain ordered laborers from France's Asian colonies to repair it.
The Germans would shell this road during the day, and the Indo-Chinese laborers would then rebuild the road at night. And it was a tremendous accomplishment to keep that one avenue open.
The French began to call the road La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way.
And it was along this artery, as some historians have said, that the lifeblood of France passed into the furnace of Verdun.
French troops rotating in first saw the sky darkened by smoke, then heard the relentless, earth-shaking artillery. Plant life in the surrounding fields disappeared. Then they met the men rotating out.
Companies of skeletons passed, sometimes commanded by a wounded officer leaning on a stick. All marched, or rather, moved forwards with tiny steps, zigzagging as if drugged. It seemed as if these speechless faces cried over something appalling, the unbelievable horrors of their martyrdom.
Despite Pétain's innovations and his troops' trust in him, Verdun was soon known as a death trap throughout the French army, and throughout the German army as well. Attrition was beginning to affect both sides.
The Germans put their men out there and left them until they were completely destroyed. Entire divisions, entire regiments, until they'd completely been gutted, and then they would pull them back, but not until they'd suffered well over 50% casualties, and it had to be rebuilt almost from scratch.
France's cult of the offensive had collided with Falkenhayn's strategy of attrition. The victims of these two policies were French and German soldiers. Infantry attacks and counterattacks followed artillery barrages. Death by friendly fire was widespread. Ground was taken, lost and retaken, over and over. After 3 months, each side had lost 100,000 men.
What they were doing, after all, was not modern fighting in the sense we understand it, getting in a tank and going into battle, or shooting and then running and hiding behind trees and shooting and so on. They're sitting in a trench for days or weeks at a time, and then a whistle goes off and they have to climb out of the trench and run straight across an open field against a machine gun that they can't see, which is going to mow them down. And they know that their chances are about 1 in 2 of surviving, and 2 in 3 of surviving intact.
When you hear the whistling in the distance, your entire body preventively crunches together. Every new explosion is a new attack, a new fatigue, a new affliction. The moment comes when the blood rushes to your head, the fever burns inside your body, and the nerves, numbed with tiredness, are not capable of reacting to anything anymore.
The front soldiers become numb by seeing the bodies without heads, without legs, shot through the belly, with blown away foreheads, with holes in their chests, hardly recognizable flabs, pale and dirty in the thick yellow-brown mud which covers the battlefield.
Verdun is a cold, muddy, bleak, unpleasant place. In 10 days in a trench, being bombarded constantly, living in a trench in which there is no sanitation, a trench containing bits and pieces of the bodies of the men who have fought in that trench for the last several months and could never be removed because it was simply too dangerous to move in those trenches. It was an entirely grim struggle simply to kill soldiers for some strategic end which must have been completely obscure to them.
The Germans were becoming as demoralized as the French. From the beginning, Falkenhayn had kept the Crown Prince, Verdun's commander, ignorant of his true goal for the battle.
It doesn't appear that the Crown Prince knew in 1916 that the plan was an attrition battle on a scale nobody had ever planned before. And when he figured it out halfway or so through the campaign, he became very despondent when it became obvious to him that rather than lead a victory march through the city of Verdun, it was his job to kill Frenchmen at a slightly higher ratio than Frenchmen killed his own soldiers.
The Germans could have won at Verdun, but Falkenhayn repeatedly refused the Crown Prince's request for more troops to finish the job. On the French side, Pétain also requested more troops from Joffre, and was also denied.
Joffre was hoarding men, shells, guns for the offensive on the Somme when the attack at Verdun took place. Pétain informed him that we will never live to see the Somme if we do not win at Verdun. Verdun is where the Battle of France is occurring. Verdun must be where all the men, all the guns, everything we have has to go here to win this battle.
And Joffre is trying to send as few troops to Verdun as possible because every division that went through what they called the meat grinder was never quite going to be the same again. So there's a tension between Pétain, who is trying to get every division that he can and use it for a brief period at Verdun, and Joffre, who's trying to keep as much of the French army untouched by this particularly hellacious experience.
By late spring, Joffre had enough of Pétain's defensive strategies. He kicked him upstairs with a promotion and turned day-to-day decision-making at Verdun over to Generals Robert Nivelle and Charles Mangin, nicknamed the Butcher. Under Nivelle and Mangin, the French would go on the offensive.
Nivelle's main innovation to the war is this concept of a rolling barrage. And the notion is to use artillery shells to pin German machine gunners in place so they can't return fire. And that's something that all armies have been working on, but Nivelle was particularly good at. Mangin's contribution is an extremely aggressive infantry school that follows behind those creeping barrages. To his credit, he was one of the few generals of this war that went on charges himself, but also, of course, took tremendous casualties.
Mangin first tried to recapture Fort Douaumont in May, using soldiers from the French colony of Senegal as shock troops. He believed they had greater resistance to pain than white soldiers. He was wrong. They were massacred, and the attack failed. Instead, the Germans won another victory with the capture of a second underground fort, Fort Vaux.
Some of the worst places to fight were in those fortifications. These are nasty, nasty subterranean passageways that are confusing, they're dark, most men had never been in places like this. It's a very different kind of warfare than the kind that you're trying to fight in a kind of linear fashion with people on your right and left, at least for some sort of cold comfort. Inside these fortifications, it's very much an individual style of combat and very, very difficult for men to deal with.
But open trenches offered scant relief. By June, Germany's massive 420mm artilleries had been used so much the gun barrels were wearing out. While waiting for replacements, the Germans pressed their advantage a new way, by lobbing shells filled with phosgene gas. They had begun using poisonous chlorine gas in 1915. France and Britain condemned them, then quickly followed suit. Phosgene, first used at Verdun, would prove 6 times more deadly than chlorine gas.
Phosgene is an asphyxiant, meaning it's a gas that you breathe into your lungs and it causes you to die of lack of oxygen. It's a dreadful weapon.
Poison gas, the most important thing that it does is force men out of their positions. It's not so much the deaths that gas causes, it's the panic, it's the forcing people out because they're so afraid of this nasty way that people do die from phosgene gases.
When word of the attack spread, nearby villages downwind tried to prepare. Civilians would largely be spared, and French gas masks proved more effective than the Germans expected. With a rallying cry, "They shall not pass," the French continued to hold Verdun, but just barely. General Joffre pleaded with France's ally Britain to begin the Battle of the Somme as soon as possible, to draw German troops away from Verdun. But when the Battle of the Somme began in July, the Germans were already reconsidering the idea of attrition.
It became obvious by late spring, early summer that Falkenhayn's strategy at Verdun simply was not working. It wasn't doing what he had expected it to do. And the decision was made by the Kaiser to remove him and replace him with the very successful German team of Hindenburg and Ludendorff.
The first sector they looked at was Verdun, and they came to the same conclusion: it's a nightmare. Yet, if they withdraw, after having told the German people since February they've been winning this battle, and the first thing they do is pull everybody back, it simply couldn't politically work. So now they too became prisoners of their own design, really. Now Verdun meant something to them in the same way it meant something to the French, and they too simply could not back out.
The Battle of Verdun, originally intended to put an end to an uncontrollable war, had become uncontrollable itself. Men not only choked from the smell of rotting corpses, even minor wounds became infected. Gangrene was rampant. Yet men continued to fight on ferociously.
The battle will not end until the last German and the last French hobble out of the trenches on crutches to exterminate each other with pocket knives or teeth and fingernails.
It's a very different kind of battle. And they're dealing with this situation day in, day out, for weeks, even months at a time. This is not a battle that gives people a mental break, and that partly explains why it's at Verdun that you start to see large numbers of what later became known as shell shock cases, where people's minds and psyches literally break down before their bodies do.
4 days and 4 nights, the last 2 days in ice-cold mud, kept under relentless fire without any protection whatsoever except for the narrow trench, which even seemed to be too wide. I arrived with 175 men. I returned with 34, of whom several have half turned insane.
The arm of a corpse lying on the parapet hit me in the face. I thought it had moved and was clawing me. Its contorted face seemed to be laughing, and its open mouth shouting at me, "Run for it! Run for it while you can! In no time you'll be a foul wreck like me!"
By October, French factories had finally produced enough big guns for a major counteroffensive, Following a blistering artillery attack, French troops recaptured Fort Douaumont and Fort Vaux. In December, both sides were back where they'd started 10 months before. With French and Germans equally exhausted and new fronts developing elsewhere, fighting at Verdun simply stopped at the end of the year 1916. It would take 2 more years of fighting and millions more dead and wounded for France to win the war, but only with the help of Britain and the United States. The cost for France was immeasurable.
This was not a battle designed to take a piece of ground. This was not a battle designed to break the enemy's lines. It's just a battle to wear one army down faster than the other army can be worn down. But both sides ground down. And it created a battlefield unlike any that had been seen in World War I before, in military history before.
Some 80% of the French army fought at Verdun, making it a nightmare experience that almost every Frenchman shared.
It came to symbolize the whole war for France, which was the bloodiest in its history, a war in which 1,375,000 French soldiers died, a figure which is more than the United States has lost in every single war we have ever fought, from the American Revolution to the present day, all added together. And the French lost that in 4 years.
Germany would invade France again 20 years later. France would surrender when the same Pétain who had fought at Verdun told the French people to stop fighting. Trusting their national hero, they did.
You have to understand the extent of the chasm that opened up underneath French self-confidence as a result of World War I. And it was in France, the Western Front, that most of the major encounters of the war happened. So it's really an international war fought on French soil for 4 long, disastrous years. France never recovered.
Through much of World War II, France was a subject nation of Nazi Germany, its fighting spirit buried 2 decades earlier at Verdun, along with a generation of its men.